Okay, so today we're going to be here and talk about language and communication development for deaf disabled children. I'll go in future slides and really talk about who we're focusing on in this presentation and what it looks like to support this unique population. Uh-oh. Okay, so here's a little overview. You can go ahead and take a look. We'll do the introduction. We'll review some terms that we'll be using. Definitely describe language access and deprivation and how that affects all people. The EHDI process, or early hearing detection and intervention, and early intervention. We'll talk about language and communication acquisition, different types of AAC, or augmentative and alternative communication, and what may be effective for different populations, supporting holistic development and language acquisition and special education needs in school. And then at the end, we'll just kind of summarize everything. So for this presentation, we'll definitely be focusing on deaf disabled children, and we'll be focusing on birth through 8 years old. I kind of chose that age group because that's selfishly my certification level. So that's the age that I specialize in early childhood. I wanted to focus on this group of people because language acquisition is so important. And this is a population that sometimes people struggle on how to support their language acquisition and language development and what that should look like. When that happens, kids are at risk of language deprivation, which will affect all areas of development. For this presentation, I want to focus on deaf disabled children who have multiple disabilities. So for this presentation, I want to make it clear that their hearing levels is not included in that umbrella term. Their multiple disabilities will be an intellectual disability and whatever else may be affected, whether that's their motoric ability, if they have autism, if they have some sort of chromosomal disorder, something like that, that will be included in their multiple disabilities code. Here are the research questions that we'll be answering throughout the presentation. We'll learn about different interventions and strategies, best practices that support deaf disabled children. We'll talk about specific communication methods in AAC for deaf disabled children. And then we'll talk about the school setting, the LRE, or least restrictive environment that may best serve deaf disabled children. So as we go through, there are different terms that I'll be using. When I refer to deaf with a capital D, that will be referring to deaf people and deaf culture, deaf identity, whereas the lowercase d will really be focusing on hearing level and hearing status. Multiple disabilities, like I said before, includes the intellectual disability, whatever else may be affecting the child, but it will not include their hearing levels. That's not included in the multiple disabilities code. We'll be using different types of identity first language. So I may say things like disabled person or autistic person, and trying to use that proud identity rather than deficit disability focus. For language versus communication, many times people think that those terms are interchangeable, but I wanted to kind of give definitions of both of those before we continue. So communication is how a person gets their point across. That may be vocalizing or gesturing, pointing, using eye gaze and looking at what they want, something like that. Whereas language is a shared system between a group of people. So you don't necessarily need to have language, or so sign language, spoken language, you don't need to have language in order to communicate. Some people are able to communicate through crying. You can communicate through your expression. So it's important to know that those two things are separate and different. And then last, we'll be talking about AAC, or augmentative and alternative communication systems. These are things that support somebody's communication that are not necessarily speaking or using sign. So here are some examples of different AAC systems that we'll be talking about a little later. Voice output devices, these may be things, if you're familiar, like switches, buttons, go talks, things that you kind of press and then they can say something for you. Same with speech generating devices, it's similar. They could be buttons, iPads when you touch and then it says a word, or picture exchange communication. These are different pictures. You can hand it to someone, they see the picture or the word that you're trying to convey. It's a whole AAC system. There's different phases to it, but this is one form of AAC that we'll also be referencing. So before we get more into things, I wanted to describe intellectual disability and kind of say what that is and give some disclaimers about why that's difficult to accurately determine for the deaf disabled population, although it's one thing that will be included within that multiple disabilities diagnosis or code. So intellectual disability is when one's cognitive level or IQ is under 70. It impacts your adaptive skills, independent living skills, problem-solving skills. So here is some information from an interview I did for another school assignment. I interviewed Dr. Ken Raymer, who works in Maryland with deaf disabled children. He was explaining that in order to try to accurately assess deaf disabled children, the psychologist should have experience with deaf children, disabled children, deaf disabled children, and best practice is to really know the student that you're assessing so you can know their communicative ability, how they move, their motoric ability, their cognitive level, so you kind of have an idea of what it looks like to work with them before you assess them. If that's not possible, then he suggests having a familiar person with them during the assessment, especially to help with that rapport and that comfortability, if that's a word, to help the assessment and help get accurate results or the most accurate results. Most of these assessments or assessments measuring intellectual ability are not normed for deaf disabled children. So it's hard to give these standardized assessments and get an accurate representation. That's why it's so important to have other people who know the child participate. So as we continue throughout this, we'll talk about language access and language deprivation and why that's so important to know about and how that affects all areas of development. So the first 5 years of life is the critical period. The brain is ready to learn language, ready to acquire language. You should have high quality language models as frequent as possible during this time. If not, then a child is at risk of language deprivation. So a child who does not have high quality language models, high quality exposure, basically all the time or while they're awake, children are at risk of language deprivation. If a child becomes language deprived, then they're at risk of not becoming fluent in any language or having native-like fluency in any language. It also affects academic ability, cognitive ability, social emotional development. People who have language deprivation are more likely to become frustrated, feel isolated, separated from maybe their family, friends, people close to them, due to the inability to effectively communicate. It can affect quality of life if someone's language deprived. And it's really important to know this background on language access. And if you don't have language access, how it affects the language or can cause language deprivation, because deaf people are at higher risk of language deprivation and disabled people are at higher risk of language deprivation. So if you're deaf disabled, you're even more increased risk for language deprivation. So that's why there really needs to be a team of people, which we'll get to support the language access basically immediately from birth. So about 95% of deaf children are born into hearing families, meaning about 95% of deaf children will likely not have immediate access to language from birth. So maybe there's a couple outliers in there who know sign language and are able to provide that high language or high quality language exposure immediately. But I would say a vast majority of those hearing families will not know sign language, will not be familiar with deaf culture, deaf identity, the deaf community, and will rely on the medical professionals or whoever they're getting their information from immediately to influence their language approach. About 40 to 50% of deaf children are born with some sort of disability. If these disabilities are immediately impact a child from birth, let's say they have some sort of like a heart defect or something else happens at birth and they need to go to the NICU, those needs will be prioritized. And then language falls even further down the list of what needs to be immediately supported. So in those cases, kids are at increased risk of not having language access compared to hearing children who may have some sort of medical need. It's important to realize that if a child does have a medical need or some sort of need that happens at birth, those will kind of compound or multiply the effects of also low hearing status, which will make, this quote says, make the compensation for loss of hearing much more difficult. So when we are looking at a deaf disabled child, there really needs to be a team of people, a team approach of people from different backgrounds and disciplines in order to make the most effective intervention plan to support the child's needs holistically. So hearing and then any additional needs that come up immediately. As we mentioned, children who are deaf disabled are at increased risk of delayed language access due to language deprivation and hearing levels. To support language access, there should always be a bilingual approach. Many times families will be led towards, hearing families will be led towards a hearing approach, that's what I'm trying to say, or will be led towards a hearing approach, and it's kind of pitted as an either or, whereas it should really be sign, as well as whatever other language approach one wants to try, depending on the residual hearing. And there's a lot of research to support bilingual development and shows cognitive benefits, that bilingual approach is the most effective. So like I mentioned, many families may be pushed or may feel like they want to try amplification devices for their children or their child because of their hearing background. They may think that if I need to try the amplification devices and then last resort I'll use sign, when really that should not be the case. When families choose their amplification devices or decide to try that route, there's a lot of information that they should be aware of, and supports reasoning that even if you try amplification devices, there should also be sign and other communication access methods. So when families decide to try an amplification device, if they decide a CI, families really should know that the results of the technology will vary. It's not an immediate success for people. There's a lot of oral rehabilitation that goes into the success of a cochlear implant. So families really should know that ahead of time. Those with complex needs may have even different outcomes, even more different outcomes when you have some sort of hearing technology. Families need to be aware that the mapping of those devices may be challenging or more challenging to accurately measure because of communicative ability, cognitive ability. So getting an accurate measure of what the child is hearing, what kind of language they're able to access auditorily may be really difficult to accurately measure. Amplification devices are not perfect. They're technology, they'll break. Sometimes it'll malfunction. I had a student with a CI and there was an issue with like the wire and the way it was. So it would blink a lot and let us know that it wasn't working. And then my DM system wouldn't work. So you can't solely rely on the hearing technology that a child may have. People with disabilities may not tolerate wearing it. If a child is deaf and autistic, they may not tolerate the sensory, the feeling of wearing something on their head or wearing something on their face, so might take it out. When that happens, you no longer have access to hearing. The child without access to hearing, if that's their only form of communication, will no longer have an effective way to communicate, to hear others. So that's why there really needs to be a bilingual approach, so that no matter what happens with one's hearing levels, they always have communication access. For early hearing detection and intervention, EHDI, early intervention, the goal is for students or for children to start receiving their services no later than 6 months. For children that we mentioned earlier who maybe have a medical need at birth, that may be even later, which puts language access and language delays. That immediate great language exposure won't necessarily happen when a child is still in the hospital, in the NICU, something like that. So kids may be delayed in their receiving of early intervention services. Once children are identified, it's so important that they start receiving their early intervention services. Research shows that the earlier that services are started, the higher the quality of the services are, the better the outcomes will be. And that's not necessarily just outcomes in infancy. That really translates through one's life. When thinking about deaf disabled children, I mentioned earlier that there really needs to be a team of people, a team approach in order to support the family and support the child. The goal of early intervention is for the professional team to support and coach the parents to maximize their ability to support their child. It's not necessarily like special education services for school-aged or preschool-aged children where you're providing direct service. It's more of a coaching model. So in this model, the team should really encourage family to learn sign language, no matter what the child's diagnoses are. This will help prevent language deprivation, even if they plan on trying amplification devices, something like that later on, before they receive those devices, before they're turned on, before they get all the therapies and rehabilitation to support their hearing or listening access, they should have access to sign to prevent that language deprivation and work on those relationships, work on that cognitive skill, and support that acquisition. Research has shown that because so many deaf children are born into hearing families, a lot of times their deaf children are the first deaf people that they'll meet. So it's super important that the EHDI team kind of teaches and coaches the family in how to facilitate positive, effective interactions with their child, because research shows that there are fewer successful moments that hearing families have with their deaf children. So in order to support those positive relationships, support that language access and help the children meet those needs, parent coaching is very effective and supportive. A team approach, depending on how the child is affected, if they have a visual impairment, their hearing status, cognitive ability, if they have a motoric need, then it should be a team of not only a teacher of the deaf, there should be a special educator, maybe a physical or occupational therapist or both, a vision teacher. All of these people have their own specialties and should collaborate to create an effective plan for the child, for the family to maximize their success in early intervention. One person will not have all the specialty information of how to best meet the child's needs. And then over here, one of the most important things that I wanted to include on this for the transdisciplinary team is the inclusion of a deaf mentor. So because so many deaf families will have no exposure to deaf people, deaf culture, deaf identity, and will only have kind of their stereotype of what they know of deaf people, having a deaf mentor can be very helpful and very supportive for families to provide an accurate representation of deaf people, how deaf people communicate with others, teach them about the deaf community, deaf culture, help the family maybe learn some sign or learn resources to access sign. And then, I'm sorry, one family who had a deaf disabled child said that by having a deaf adult on their team, they became better decision makers and were better able to support their child based on the information and relationship they built with their deaf mentor. So when thinking about a child's disabilities, whatever the child's primary need is, those characteristics, that disability, will be even more amplified by their hearing level. So if a child has a cognitive need, then language acquisition will be impacted. If they are also deaf, then their language acquisition will be even more impacted. Although acquisition of language and learning of language may be a slower pace, it's so important that the team continues and supports this because it leads to positive quality of life. I can't imagine inability to communicate with somebody else. I've heard from families that I work with that communication is always their first priority. It really needs to be put at the forefront for all people. Deaf disabled children may stay at the pre-linguistic stage of language longer than hearing children with disabilities. This is a stage that people are communicating with kind of gestures, vocalizations, before they have those words yet. But the pre-linguistic stage helps develop into the symbolic stage of language. That is when somebody is able to use signs, words, or AAC in order to communicate. If somebody does not have communication, this will lead to increased frustration, decreased motivation, in lack of motivation to communicate, increased isolation. So getting some sort of communication and starting to build those foundational skills is incredibly important, no matter what age the person or child is. So now we can finally start getting into AAC. So alternative and augmentative communication is anything that somebody uses to try and communicate, to try and express themselves, in addition to signing or speaking. So AAC can be aided, which means something additional, or unaided, meaning it's just them and their bodies. Unaided AAC may be gesturing, vocalizing, crying, if it's used for communicative purposes, or for some hearing people, signs can be a form of unaided AAC because it's nothing in addition to your body, it's just using your body to sign. But for a deaf person, I would argue that signing is not an unaided form of AAC because it's a native language. So I would consider those separate for hearing or deaf people. Aided AAC are things in addition to the person's body. So it may be like picture exchange. It may be something like an iPad where you press buttons, an individual button or switch. Those are forms of aided AAC, which are in addition to your body. A lot of people have a misconception that if somebody uses AAC, then it will decrease their speaking or decrease their signing ability, and that's not the case. It actually supports communication development, language development, no matter what kind of communication you're using. AAC is really important, and it should be used in conjunction with signing, speaking, whatever the language approach is. It should never be used in place of signing. It's just an addition. So when thinking about which AAC system somebody wants to try with their child or students, whoever, here are some things that should be considered. So first, like I just said, AAC, different communication strategies that should never be used in place of signing or in place of speaking only. It should really be used all together and just as an additional support. When you're choosing which type of system may be best for a child, you should really look at the child holistically and do a little bit of some sort of pre-assessment to see what would be most appropriate. So if a child has a visual impairment, then something pretty small, no high contrast, no objects, maybe that's not the best starting point when you're thinking about a child with a visual impairment. High contrast, maybe tangible objects. You want to consider their strengths and area of need and kind of match them to a system, and then trial and error, because it's never a guarantee that something's going to work great. When you're using AAC, you should really be using it across all environments. It should be used at school, it should be used at home, it should be used in the community. It shouldn't really be kept to one place, because then the skills, those communication skills that they're learning, aren't generalized among settings and not generalized among people. So you really want those skills to go everywhere with the child and learn that they can communicate with lots of different people using the same strategies. When you are choosing vocabulary, what you're going to start with, you want to start, usually, depending on the person, with just a few words, pictures, whatever your system is, rather than using 50 words at once. You want to try and prioritize the child's favorite things, favorite foods, or you can also incorporate core words, which are the most frequently used words, like go, eat, drink, want. Those are examples of core words. But you want to use words that you'll use a lot and may be highly motivating for the person. Using explicit opportunities to use language and to teach using AAC is a good strategy. One thing that we do in school is like sabotaging the environment. I remember for my capstone presentation, somebody was like, "What does that mean?" They were like, "That does not sound good." But by doing that, by putting things out of reach, the child is really forced to ask and use their system, use their sign, use some sort of language to let you know what they want. So maybe they want goldfish, you put it within eyesight, but out of reach. And then the child is gesturing to it, pointing at it, something, and you say, "Oh, I see you want some fish or crackers." Modeling the language using the AAC, "I want crackers," showing them, they do it. You're kind of setting up those situations that you can model the language, which kind of goes into here, scripting. "I want crackers." Then you're providing that model, reducing that cognitive load for the child, and they are able to copy you with whatever your system may be. But those are more explicit opportunities. That's more of systematic instruction, so really teaching them how to do it, rather than a natural opportunity. So that kind of covered a couple of these. In addition, providing wait time. Kids will need repetition and practice of skills. So you're not just going to model things once. You're not just going to sabotage once. You're going to do it over and over again so that the child can practice these skills, because it will not be mastered immediately. And then sometimes there are questions as to whether kids, let's say they're using a button, whether they realize pressing that button with the picture on it is cause and effect, like, "Oh, if I press this, then I get my crackers." Or if the child realizes, "I am pressing this saying this picture of a cracker is exactly what I want." So in order to kind of assess the comprehension of what they're saying, the expressive communication of what they're saying, you can kind of do a little informal assessment. One example listed here is providing the real objects first. So in the goldfish or crackers example, I would have goldfish and maybe pretzels. I would show the child, they're going for the goldfish. I take it away. I provide the AAC, goldfish, or pretzels. If they match, if they ask for the goldfish in that field of 2, then it's matching. You can see that they are expressing exactly what they want. Whereas if they go for the other thing, oh, nope, you wanted goldfish. And then you kind of need to do that reteaching and revisiting because what they want did not match. Uh-oh. So there's so many benefits of using AAC in addition to sign. It prevents communication breakdowns. Communication breakdown is when what you're trying to communicate is not understood. When you have a lot of communication breakdowns, then it's going to decrease the user's motivation, increase frustration, increased isolation, and decrease communicative attempts. So sign language should always be used with deaf people. Deaf disabled people will sometimes use modified signs that make sense to them and make sense to familiar people. So I have a student who used to sign want like this and sign swing like this. So when he would communicate with me, I could see he's saying this, oh, great 2-word utterance, you want swing, and he would immediately get it. If he's with an unfamiliar person, if he meets a deaf person out in the community, if he has a different teacher, if, I don't know, somebody else is with him and he does this, they will not understand what he's trying to communicate, leading to a communication breakdown. So it's so important to have some additional form of communication for those unfamiliar people, and incorporating that as the child especially gets older and is hopefully more independent. They should really have an additional form of communication so that they have increased number of communication partners. If the team decides that you want to try like a button, something like that, there should always really be a picture on it of what the person is trying to communicate. If you're using something like a GoTalk or an iPad, having the pictures with the words is really important, because if the child goes to press something and the volume is down, if it doesn't sound right, if it sounds like this, if it sounds like this, then you need to have pictures or the written words to avoid a communication breakdown, because the person with a low hearing level, the deaf disabled person, won't be able to tell. They'll be communicating effectively with their AAC and not know if the sound is low. So that's why whatever the system is, there should really be pictures or pictures and words so that the message is always communicated. As you have a communication system that you're trialing, you need to progress monitor. You need to monitor the number of communication attempts, successful communication interactions, the expressive and receptive language or vocabulary that the child has. See if it's a steady increase, if they're increasing their communication attempts across settings, if it's a plateau, if it's decreasing, so that you can make any changes that are necessary, because it really is a trial and error system until you find a great match with a child. Here are some strategies or AAC systems that are recommended based on different disabilities. Dual sensory impairment, there's a decent amount of research and direct recommendations, whereas for deaf autistic people and deaf people with physical disabilities, there are not as many direct matches. So the research taken is kind of a combination of research for autistic people, research for physical or physically disabled people, and then dual sensory impairment. For all three, there's a recommendation of direct instruction, explicit instruction, repetition and practice, and teaching strategies based on behavioral theory. So you want to use reinforcement, chaining of skills to teach using the AAC system. For deaf autistic people, as I mentioned, there's no direct research. So this is based on autistic people in general. There's a lot of interventions that have been proven to be effective that are visually based. So the picture exchange communication system is one form of AAC that has been very helpful with the autistic community, handing pictures. As I mentioned before, there's different phases of the PEC system, and you chain those skills together to support communication and acquisition of language. For the deaf autistic community, it's been seen that there's a lot of errors when I was talking about modified signs, errors in palm orientation for signs and shapes, but especially palm orientation. So sometimes, again, those signs will get confused if you're already using modified signs. So that's why an additional system, AAC system, is really important to start including and using with this population. For people who have dual sensory impairments, the team should always assess residual hearing and residual vision before, so that you know the level of adaptations, I guess, that you'll need with the person. Using tactile strategies have been proven to be effective. Using kind of a PEC system with objects. So exchanging objects rather than pictures has been proven to be effective. But you always want to make sure that the objects that you're using make sense, not necessarily to you, but to the user. So they should always make sense. So if they're feeding and you're trying to teach feeding object exchange with feeding, something like that, if the person has a G-tube, you maybe aren't using a fork, but maybe using a syringe. So something like that to make sure it makes sense and connects specifically with that person. Making sure that you're really supporting the consent. So kind of going hand under hand when you're putting objects in the person's hand, so then they can retract if they do not want to communicate at that time. Making sure that everything is very consensual and you guys are on the same page in terms of prompting and support. Some people who have dual sensory impairment won't need that high level or the object representation. Some people may be able to use pictures on high contrast, real pictures of objects. So assessing what level, if they have CVI, what stage or what level their CVI is in, so you know how much needs to be modified and adapted for them. If a child has physical disabilities, then you should really be collaborating with an OT and a PT to see how to maximize their access. If that's an iPad, maybe you're adding like a key guard on top so that you can support the person in finger isolation. And then if they are struggling between buttons, the key guard kind of helps them identify what they're trying to get. If that's not effective, you can put buttons anywhere. You can put them near somebody's head. You can put them near somebody's feet, somebody's elbows, if they're unable to use their hands at that point, depending on their level of motoric ability. There's also eye gaze devices. They can be super high tech or pretty homemade and low tech, which are the ones that I have more experience with. But these are all things that should be considered with that transdisciplinary team so that you are trial and erroring things based on the student's strengths. Thinking about school setting, first I'll just do a brief overview of just special ed law before we kind of talk about the classroom settings and what's going to best support deaf disabled children. So the Individuals with Disabilities Act is a law that mandates children birthed through 21, depending on their needs, has access to special education services. These children will have either an IFSP, depending on their age, or an IEP, which will outline their services, strengths, needs, and whatever the kind of intervention plan is, depending on that age, their goals and objectives, or like the family service. And then also within the IEP document, the school age document, somebody's least restrictive environment or their kind of classroom-based services will be outlined. So typically, a person's goal in special education is to be in a mainstreamed environment, in a general education class, receiving their special education supports in the general education setting. That's what's considered the least restrictive, meaning the person can be most independent there. Typically, the child's primary need is what will determine their classroom setting or their least restrictive environment or LRE. This puts an IEP team for deaf disabled children in a difficult situation because the team then is determining what the child's primary need is. Are you saying their primary need is autism and their hearing status isn't as important? Or maybe their hearing status is the most important. So for example, if a child's primary disability is autism, and they really need a structured environment, low student to teacher ratio, an autism-based program may be the most appropriate for them. But then what happens for their deaf and hard of hearing needs? So we'll kind of get into what that looks like. We know that deaf children need language access at all times to support their development, to support their academic access, to support their relationships, cognitive ability. So the lack of access will impact their ability to access instruction and their development and across all areas. So as we mentioned, instruction should be delivered in the best language modes, the best form of communication. A lot of times deaf disabled children will not have that access to language because their needs are prioritized. Let's say if they have cerebral palsy and intellectual disability, then that will often be prioritized before their hearing needs. But like we said, there's a relationship between school and academic success and access to language. Deaf disabled children should also have access to teachers who sign, peers who sign, have those peer role models, similar to students in hearing students who have like opportunities for inclusion when they're in a self-contained special education class and then go to, they're included for different parts of the school day. Those are the peer models to provide language models, behavioral models, whatever else. Deaf children should really have those opportunities as well. But for their language inclusion and language models in a mainstream setting, you're often with hearing children. So you don't have those high quality sign models like you would hope. Families who have deaf disabled children preferred residential settings because they felt that their child was more included and their child's needs were met better than a mainstream setting, and they were able to meet and maximize their academic success. So based on these factors, here are some recommendations that I've kind of gathered from research of what the recommendations are in terms of maximizing language support in schools. So for all of these programs, or for the most part, all these programs, a co-taught model would be most effective. So a co-taught model between a special educator as well as a deaf educator. So by having multiple teachers, the child's needs are not prioritized because the child's holistic development is what's important. They need to support their deaf identity, language access and sign, connection to deaf culture. That's one side of the importance, but then also their learning needs, whatever specific characteristics they may have from their disability. So not one of those should be prioritized. It should all be met at all times to support that child with the special education and hearing services that they deserve. So the best option would be if a residential deaf school had some sort of special education program, so the child could go to a deaf school, have their deaf peers and role models have that language access at all times from basically all people in the building. That would be the best setting. After that, some mainstream schools have deaf and hard of hearing programs, kind of depending on your district, depending on your area. So in that setting, if there was a co-taught program between a deaf and hard of hearing deaf and hard of hearing teacher and a special educator, those two people collaborating and leading a team or leading their class for deaf disabled children, that may be a good option. And then those children would also have peer models throughout and opportunities to interact with other deaf children, signing adults in the school because there's a deaf and hard of hearing program there. Another option would just be a co-taught program for deaf disabled children, but not necessarily in a school with a deaf and hard of hearing program. In that case, the child would still have access to sign and would still have access to their supports needed for their special education needs, but they would not have access to other signing peers and other signing adults. I would say, because it's not a perfect world and resources available in the county, different things like that, the option that most people receive, or a lot of people receive, and who have special education needs as well, so who are deaf disabled, will receive an itinerant teacher of the deaf. So they'll come in for maybe 30 minutes or 1 hour a week to work on those deaf and hard of hearing needs in a mainstreamed hearing or a special education class with hearing children in a hearing school. And the itinerant teacher kind of plugs in and tries to support those services. Really don't support a deaf child and maximize their language opportunities as much as the other options do. So before we summarize, here's going back to the research questions. So what strategies, interventions work best and support language and communication development best for deaf disabled children? What communication methods best support this population? And is there a relationship between a school setting and language development? And what does that relationship look like? What are the best supports that a school can provide? So families should provide access to, or should try to provide access to sign as soon as possible, as soon as their child's hearing level is identified, to try and prevent language deprivation. And although most families probably will not know sign language who have deaf children, they should try their best to learn as soon as possible. A transdisciplinary team, so that team of different providers based on the child's needs, should all work together, should adapt interventions, and really customize a plan to support their child's language access, and support their holistic development. Sign language and AAC should be used together. AAC should never be used in place of sign, and this supports a bilingual approach to development for a child. AAC should be introduced early. It helps increase the number of communication partners. It helps decrease communication breakdowns, especially with unfamiliar people. And it should be available across different settings to support that generalization of skills, no matter where the person is. Using a systematic style of instruction, wait time, those aspects of learning related to behavioral theory, those should always be used with people who have an intellectual disability, who are deaf disabled, to help teach the use of AAC. If you're using a system, an AAC system, there should always be some sort of pictures included with it, or words, some sort of object to match the meaning of the word, to prevent communication breakdowns. Because as we mentioned earlier, if you're pressing a button and there's no picture there, and the volume's down, or technology's not working, needs new batteries, the person with a low hearing status, the deaf disabled person, won't realize that the message is not being delivered, which will lead to a communication breakdown. AAC systems should be determined based on the holistic needs of a child. You should always do that pre-assessment to kind of eliminate some options, highlight some options, and really match to the child and their needs. You should always progress monitor to assess how effective the communication system or AAC system that you're trialing is, and whatever changes may you need to make or revisit with your team. There definitely is a relationship between school setting and language development. Across all options, a co-teaching model would be a great option for deaf disabled children. It's, I would say, usually unusual for there to be a special educator or a deaf educator who is dual certified in those areas and able to teach this deaf disabled population. So therefore, co-teaching model between a deaf educator and a special educator is so important, either in a residential setting, in a setting with a program, a DHOH program, or just a mainstreamed school with this kind of co-taught program to support the deaf disabled children, so that one of their needs is not prioritized and the team isn't determining which aspect of the child they're going to try and support the most, rather than supporting their holistic development and ensuring that there's language access at all times throughout the day for all children. So at the end, I really liked this quote. I think it's so important. Everybody needs communication access. It supports relationships. It supports quality of life. Although it may take a lot of time, trial and error, progress monitoring, direct instruction, and a lot of support from different teammates and team members, it should always be continued, prioritized and worked on with a team, because the quality of life and the whatever comes with communication is so key for all people, no matter their cognitive ability or hearing status or anything else. And then a lot of references.